Good afternoon. We are Group 2, and today we will be focusing primarily on Chapter 10 and 11 of Levy's book, as well as Week 8's readings. Some common themes include the beginning of American capitalism, as well as the factors which led to the organization of labor unions. That can be seen across the various sources we'll be diving into. There was worker exploitation, low pay, poor conditions, and economic climate, and these all contribute to the inspiration behind the formation of unions.
Women held a very important role in the economic category of the 19th century, though often they were overlooked. They were noted for their household services in the 19th century, which held social and economic value. Women provided services that could be defined as a necessity, however, the wages would speak otherwise. Angel Kwolek-Foland explains that these services were assigning value to certain basic social needs and relations, such as finding a room for a tired traveler or feeding the hungry. We cannot exist without these services, therefore we pay to have them. Women are often correlated with the historical context of work in regards to two realms: domestic and personal services, and clerical work and retail. We see women dominate the domestic work and personal services in the 18th century. These include things like hat making and nursing. In the 19th century, the U.S. became a service society, and this is where we see the domination of women in the field of clerical work and retail. As we learned earlier in the course, the father was the head of the household and the breadwinner, where the family was valued as a unit and provided goods or services. When these goods and services were performed by women in the household, it did not carry nearly as much economic value as in the marketplace. Cleaning and cooking may be considered a private activity when performed without pay. When handled by an attendant or a cooker, the labor is valued according to its quality.
Noam Gore is well known when it comes to the world of capitalism. After all, he does teach courses on the history of capitalism at Cornell University. But I digress. We are not here to advertise another university. Instead, we shall focus on Magore's article to coddle and caress these great capitalists. One thing to take away from this article is his use of Charles Francis Adams Jr., who was a former U.S. representative. You might be wondering, well, how did he use him and why does this matter? Let me explain it to you. Adams is repeatedly referenced in the article, and it is quite clear that much of the material Magore uses stems from Adams' writings. Magore writes, quote, Adams' reflections on the connections between the financial resources of the East and the railroad development in the vast expanses of the West were grounded the key axis of American capitalism in the closing decades of the 19th century. Now, the formation of a national economy was controversial, and such political projects would pit the East capitalists and the Western populace against each other. But I might be getting too far ahead. Let's backtrack. Remember this, the East was relatively well off. They were capital saturated, meaning a time where both the companies and the people spent a lot on consumption. On the other side are the poor people living in the West. Adams explains how people on the prairie yearned for railroads because they believed it would bring quote-unquote commercial possibilities. And so, with this dream, they invited foreigners to build the railroads for them. Unfortunately, reality hit and they couldn't afford to pay for the massive costs of this system of transportation. Magore writes, quote, the impetuous farmers thus turned against their eastern benefactors, with their anger blazed up, and became deaf to reason, to law, or consideration of remote self-interest, end of quote. Let's just say there was more fuel added to the fire of hatred between the two. This situation connects with Adams' reflections of the key axis of American capitalism. You see, Eastern money traveled across the continent in order to finance railroads, and money was consistently flowing. Something to note about this article is the use and support of the Granger laws. No, not Hermione Granger from Harry Potter. I'm talking about the actual law. The Granger laws were founded by Oliver Hudson Kelley and are state laws that were passed in a few Midwestern states during the late 1860s and the early 1870s. What did they do? These laws regulated grain and railroad freight. During this time, companies were charging farmers an arm and a leg, metaphorically, of course, to store and transport the crops. There was a lot of public support, and in the article, Adam characterized these laws as a migration of financial sources to the West. This ultimately brought the Great West into the economic orbit belonging to the U.S. But I digress. American capitalism was slowly transforming the U.S. into an industrial nation. Sure, it came with its troubles, but it paints out the growth of the economic world tied to the U.S. It's a fact that historians of the business would look over the continental scale belonging to the modern U.S. economy. But don't quote me on that. Quote Magor, who also brings in how American populists were often overlooked. Yet these populists would soon turn the tides. Magor writes, quote, despite their general sense of grievance against Eastern capitalists, Western Constitution writers were clearly not impetuous or somehow reckless. Rather, they creatively and thoughtfully sought to translate economic priorities and ideological commitments into the policy. End of quote. They would structure relationships with precision, thus harnessing Eastern money in order to fulfill their vision of a balanced regional economy.
In order to understand the early labor movement, one must first have a grasp on early populism. Populism, in its most basic form, is the juxtaposition of the people versus the elite. U.S. populism finds its roots in Jacksonian rhetoric of equality of commercial opportunity, as well as William Jennings Bryan, who used said rhetoric to boost his national profile. Bryan equated a wage worker with the owner class, referring to them both as businessmen. The employees were just as worthy of a noble title as the employer. Bryan's reasoning stemmed from the idea that a farmer uses just as much, if not more, in mental physical labor than a man on the board of trade who simply bets on the price of grain. It was the classic us versus them mentality, but instead of being based on race, ethnicity, gender, or culture, it was based on class, owner versus the owned. Bryan would go on to attempt to run for president in 1896 to lose to William Mckinley, but it was clear that Bryan lit a spark. U.S. populism would continue to struggle, while populist movements would do their best to preach about equality. They often fell into the usual trap of blaming economic inequality on minority groups. By the turn of the 20th century, the populist movement began to switch gears. Rather than discussions over ownership of capital, they began talking more in line with regulation and wages. Speaking of switching gears, I think it's also important to discuss the activities of labor groups such as the Farmers Alliance and Knights of Labor during this time period. The Farmers Alliance found its roots in socialistic policies, originally being a farmers' mutual aid society. The goal of many labor supporters was to create cooperatives, a business structure in which workers owned what they produced. In the case of the Alliance, they wanted farmers to be able to store their own crops, giving them a greater share over their market power. In the late 1880s, a Farmers Alliance became a social movement fueled by anti-monopoly ideology, working towards building this cooperative economic structure. The labor group ran headfirst into opposition with Jay Gould's Texas and Pacific Railway, which opened possibilities for commercial production. Farmers began to complain against discriminatory railroad rates, insufficient money supply, and high levels of debt. The Knights of Labor and Farmers Alliance supported each other in strikes against Gould. However, Gould succeeded in surviving the strike, leading to a decline in the Knights. While the majority of farmers didn't join the Farmers Alliance, they understood their grievances. The Farmers Alliance would go on to charge railroad corporations with discriminating against small rural customers and continue to fight against monopolization. The cooperative movement never really got off the ground for a variety of reasons, mostly centering on lack of capital, funding, and credit. They shifted their focus away from cooperatives and focusing on state regulations. All of this might seem like the labor movement was a failure. I wanted to showcase that in a capitalist, business-focused society, labor will always have an uphill battle to climb. There were a variety of successes worthy of note, particularly when it came to influencing both parties. Republican legislatures passed laws such as anti-monopoly regulations and regulations against railroad rate discrimination. Democrat legislatures also passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which allowed the federal government to regulate businesses and to allow for consumer-friendly trade and encourage competition.
I will now be going over the rest of the chapter. In my presentation, I'll be going over three major topics. I will be going over globalization and the election of 1896, the Great Recapitalization, and progressive income politics. I want to start off by giving a little bit of background information about 1896 and what was going on during that time. The Civil War just ended in 1965 and the economy is in question. The Panic of 1893 just happened in America. It's been the worst depression it's ever been in. Two candidates are going up against each other for the presidency, William Jennings Bryan and William Mckinley. After British investors pulled out of companies in the West, the American economy took a major blow, and the stop of productions begun. McKinley won by supporting the gold standard and industrial growth. The Panic of 1893 would end in 1897. From 1893 to 1896, farmers began to lose 22% of their total earnings. In the South, we would also see a large spike in racial activity. Plessy versus Ferguson was also a major ruling that created the beginning of segregation in the United States. The Supreme Court favored segregation being separate but equal. I will now be going over the Great Recapitalization, but we first have to talk about the Great Merger Movement. It was a movement that merged companies together to make larger ones. From 1895 to 1904, about 1,800 corporations turned into 157. This is a strategy that made the United States credible. I want to take a moment to talk about the person who popularized this idea. His name was John Pierpont Morgan. After his father's death, he created his company called J.P. Morgan & Co. His rise to fame was big guy eat little guy. He almost forced all railroad companies to work under him. This was called Morganization. Many corporations soon followed his footsteps to create monopolies across the United States. The Great Recapitalization was a rebirth in American economy. J.P. Morgan also led the steel industry, making U.S. goods highly profitable. Near the end of his life, J.P. Morgan was one of the richest men in history. Lastly, I will briefly go over the next major part of the chapter, progressive income politics. In the world of Morganization, there was a need to regulate this new power some companies had. In 1912, the United States decided to split up Rockefeller's company into 40 different ones because of the oil industry. Wilson had a favor of competition in the economy. Bryan thought it was a bad idea for the United States to intervene. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Wilson's idea of an economy. Now, even the United States still was safe from the progressive income politics. In 1913, the United States created the Federal Reserve Act, which created banks to overlook economic stability.
Hi everyone, this is Marissa and I'm going to be covering Fordism, which comes from chapter 11 of Levy. So before getting into the details of Fordism, I'd like to briefly introduce Henry Ford's background in philosophy. He was born of a farming family in Michigan, but did not want to carry on his family's trade. By age 16, he left to Detroit to become an apprentice for a machinist, and after that he had become an engineer for Edison. Here he met his idol Thomas Edison himself and was encouraged to continue his side experience on creating the horseless carriage. Another figure of Ford's was Ralph Waldo Emerson, who he deemed the conquered philosopher. Ford's own philosophy was centered around the idea that machines should do more work, which would then allow more leisure time for people. This concept meant people in this rapidly urbanizing world would then be able to enjoy the outdoors and generally higher quality of life. By 1899, Ford resigned from Edison and had a short failed business venture after. However, with the help of local investors, he and his fellow innovator, Henry Wells, designed a new automobile. Upon this success, in 1901, the Henry Ford Company was established. Ultimately, Ford left a lasting impression amongst the manufacturing world as its production system allowed for goods to pass at high speeds. This terminology for this method was identified by Ford as mass production. In 1909, Ford saw a benefit in focusing on just one design, the Model T. At this point, all the labor was specifically skilled and everything was done by hand. However, Ford wanted to see more speed in production. In 1910, he worked with a German architect to create concrete-based buildings that did not require pillars as support beams throughout the factory, which then helped maximize space. He also was sure to design his factory to have sequential workstations, where each station had just one part to focus on, essentially the beginning of a functioning assembly line. Not only did this help accelerate the speed of production, it also reduced time by workers not having to walk across the factory for different tasks. By 1913, the assembly line was now down to a science, where each person had a specific task that they repeatedly did as they passed the part down a belt, which was fueled by power generators known as magnetos. The worker's task could then be as simple as fastening a clamp or tightening a nut. They would repeat the same action throughout their entire shift. For perspective, in 1910, Ford Motor Company had sold 20,000 Model T automobiles. By 1916, the annual sales were at 585,000. Once massively produced, the price of this particular model went from $780 to $360. Mass production allowed for a cheaper product. However, this removed the need for skilled labor, and some felt like slaves under Ford. He therefore banned labor unions by firing anyone who joined them. He exploited European immigrants for their labor and their desperate need for work. Workers were unhappy, and about 10% of Ford's workforce would not show up for their shifts every day, ranging from the years of 1913 to 1914. Ford responded by offering a higher wage, going from $2.50 a day to $5 a day in January of 1914. He claimed this to be a social justice, but in reality he increased the pay because he saw his own workforce as potential customers. He believed that mass production should allow for mass consumption, and with the raise they could now afford to buy his cars. He also wanted to control his employees outside of work, and he deemed that more than half of their wages was given an agreement that they would not be involved in riotous behavior. He forbade his workers from drinking and encroached on their personal lives. After World War I, the United States was facing a cycle of inflation, then deflation. This caused the building of new factories to be difficult. Ford responded by heavily investing in the River Rouge complex, a total of $60 million of his own capital, along with the help of other investors such as JP Morgan. He then announced to the country that he would be building this factory complex to create more jobs. However, the success of completing this project was not always certain. Not only was the continually shifting economy a trouble, he was also facing the threat of unions. In 1919, 4 million workers went on strike, demanding the 8-hour workday and better pay. Along with this, JP Morgan's headquarters were bombed by anarchists, which killed 38 people, and wealthy capitalists surely were getting nervous. However, although the economic and social climate was unstable, the Rouge was completed by the late 1920s, which was noted as a modern symbol of the machine age. There was a total of 93 buildings spread across 1,100 acres, including numerous types of plants and mills, a hospital, a motion picture laboratory, and an airport. He again used architecture to maximize efficiency, making all the buildings one story and made of concrete. The Rouge became this extraordinary symbol of both economic modernism and cultural modernism, as it had become a muse for artists. Notably, Frida Kahlo's husband, Diego Rivera, who was a famous Marxist muralist from Mexico, had been commissioned by Ford's sons to paint a mural. Upon the success of the Rouge, Ford was increasingly paranoid of labor unions, and his policies reflect this. At one point, his anti-union enforcer was walking around the Rouge with a gun. Manufacturing caused unions to decrease almost 10%, and Ford was militant in his actions to avoid any chance of new unions rising in his company. He turned to hiring black residents that were fleeing the South and expected their loyalty as a return. However, due to Ford's choices of political candidates, he lost their support. Along with this, he sent spies into Detroit's Industrial United Automobile, Aircraft, and Vehicle Union. Any employee that was caught in association was quickly fired.